Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. After modern developments in physics, some scientists have dismissed the function of philosophers. Somehow, they thought that philosophy is subordinated to science. I do not agree with that. What did they think it is wrong with philosophy? Logic? Induction? The idea that your theory has to be consistent with experiment? The idea that every scientific theory has to conform to the proper rules of reasoning? The scientific method itself? All these things come from, and are founded on philosophy. For instance, you can never prove a contradiction by experiment. There are no contradictions in reality and there will never be. And it is the scientist who must pass the test of logical consistency or fail. Logic is the ultimate arbiter of scientific validity. No experiments can or ever will contradict or surpass philosophy. And I want to start with an imaginary story, an analogy that I think will clarify the nature of the question I will try to convey here. Let's go to a very distant past, to the first scientists in history, those who started from total ignorance. They do not know anything about physical laws or natural phenomena. And then, they make the following experiment. They put a test tube inside a glass full of water. One of the scientists looks at the glass and sees something never seen before. Incredibly, the tube is bent. But this is not the problem. There is nothing metaphysically impossible for an object to be bent. The problem is that another observer looked along the inside of the tube, which by the way is full of air, and he can testify that the tube is straight. The tube is bent and straight at the same time. It is bent for scientist A, and straight for scientist B. So they conclude, there is not a single tube or a single fact. They will call it relativity of bending. So, you have to abandon the classical notions of quote, common sense, that is, of logic, in regard to, unusual special, tubes and water. Then, it will come Mr. Occam Razor, and he will say, of course, the tube is bent for observer A, and straight for observer B. After all, this is more likely than all those unnecessary complexities of optics, refraction, etc. Then they will blame the philosopher. You said that this was impossible. You said that A is A, that nothing can be true and false at the same time and in the same respect. And it turns out that philosophy is disproved, that logic is disproved, that philosophy is useless. You must accept the evidence from experiments. You must abandon philosophy and accept the idea of relativity of bending. We repeated the experiment many times. Scientists around the world did the very same experiment, with more purified water, more accurate tubes. We built water glasses of several kilometers in size. We spent billions of taxpayers' money. Philosophy is dead, and I recall at least two famous scientists who said this explicitly, to my knowledge Hawkins and Feynman. Philosophy is dead, my friends. Of course, the philosopher will insist, and I mean a good philosopher. He will say, no. I am not scientist, that is your job, but all I can say about my job is that something must be wrong here. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing can be so and not so at the same time. When referring to reality, to physical entities, when asserting something about a real thing, there can be no different facts or realities for different observers, or in other words, contradictions cannot exist. You asserted a contradiction, you must be wrong. And now, I don't know why this is happening, but there must be some explanation that reconciles that apparent contradictory observations. If both observers do not agree on facts, if you insist on misplacing the pieces of the puzzle, the error will not go away. It will propagate towards more and more incorrect constructions, it will cause more and more errors, it will stall scientific progress, and the picture will never end as it ought to be. Did this, quote, widely tested, relativity of bending, prove that the shape of an object is observer-dependent? Did this experiment prove that the shape of a tube is, quote, relative? But for this imaginary scientists, there is still a long way to go. A lot of things to know, in order to solve this mystery. They must discover what is light, that it has an undulatory nature, that it travels at different speeds through different mediums, that this causes a change of trajectory, and this creates an alteration of the image of the tube. That is, they must first discover refraction in order to understand that what all observers are seeing is not a bent tube, but the refracted light or a virtual image of a straight tube. The tube is really straight. It is straight for both observers, it was straight all the time, and it is straight for everyone to see and verify. And finally, the happy end of this history will teach us a lesson. The philosopher was right, there is only one reality, the same facts for everyone. The philosopher pointed in the right direction, in inspiring scientists to try to discover missing knowledge. But they rejected philosophy, and they got crushed by it. When I became interested in relativity, I tried to browse across discussions on internet, and I found many so-called crank science and opinions. Many of the people that tries to find a flaw in relativity are constantly being beaten because they usually misunderstand many things, or miss important points. But that will not happen to me. Because the ground for the rejection of relativity is the most basic principle: facts are facts, there are no contradictions in reality, which means, no different facts for different observers, ever. Facts must be the same for every observer in respect to the same thing. Contradictions, i.e., different facts for different observers, are impossible. Now let's go to relativity. If light is a wave, like a classical wave in the surface of a fluid, then it must travel at some characteristic speed c. The Michelson and Morley experiment was performed with a very accurate device for measuring the speed of traveling light waves. The device has two equal optical channels, or arms, put in perpendicular position. If the instrument is not moving, and light is emitted from a common point, it will travel at speed c through both arms, and return to the origin, at the same time. But if the Earth is moving through space at some speed, then it should be possible to rotate the instrument until one of the arms is aligned with this motion, and we will find that the time that light takes to travel back and forth, along one arm, will be different compared to the other arm. It was expected to find such difference. It was expected that the speed of light, c, and the speed of the observer will add or subtract. That is what happens with ordinary moving things. But what they found is that the interval of time taken to light, to traverse back and forth both arms, is equal and do not change with the speed of motion of the instrument. If the arm has some specific length, and time of travel along the arm back and forth gives always the same value, then we calculate the speed of light to be invariant no matter the speed of the instrument. What they really found is that light speed measured by an instrument does not change with the motion of the instrument, and therefore the motion of Earth through space cannot be measured or detected. Why the speed of light is invariant? Why the motion of the observer does not add to light speed? Why c plus something is c? After the experiment, Lorentz hypothesized that the measuring instrument could contract with velocity in such a proportion, so that this will explain the result. In other words, the constancy of the speed of light could be explained by length contraction of the instrument in the direction of motion by gamma factor. Of course, this attempt was rejected as being an ad hoc explanation, which means, trying to save a theory from experimental failure, or trying to refuse to give up a preconceived idea. Now let's continue with the classical experiment, the moving train with mirrors. I choose this experiment because it is basically the same that the arm of the Michelson instrument. There are two mirrors at both ends of the train, an emitter of light pulses at the center, and a chronometer which measures the interval it takes for light to travel back and forth along the train. As Michelson and Morley proved, the observer A inside the train will always verify the same amount of time taken to the light pulses to travel back and forth, no matter the speed of the train. This is interpreted by moving observer A to mean that light speed is always c, so that t is this. And this means that, as can be seen in this animation, both pulses travel at c with respect to the train, and therefore reach the mirrors simultaneously at time t1. But this is not the problem. The problem comes when we add a second observer B, an observer that is in the ground motionless. To this observer, light also travels always at c, but, with respect to him, not the train, and to him the light traveling inside the train must do something different. This is what happens according to stationary observer. Light pulse traveling backward takes this interval to hit the mirror, and the forward pulse reaches the mirror, at. So for him, the two pulses reaches the mirrors, not at the same time. The two observers disagree on what happens. Moving observer says the two events happen simultaneously, and static observer says the same events happen at different times, t1 and t2. And here we are, the same two events, and keep in mind that we are speaking about what happens, about reality, about facts. The same two events happen simultaneously and not simultaneously. Something is true and false at the same time. Something is true for observer A, and false for observer B. If you ask a relativist if it is true or false that the pulses reach the mirrors at the same time, they will not be able to answer. They do not know if something is real or not, because for them, there are as many mutually contradictory realities as there are frames of reference, that is, infinite. But there is only one reality, no disagreement, no contradictions. Relativity has to be wrong by principle. Moreover, we do not need contradictory facts to explain relativistic experiments. It does not have to be that way. There is another explanation for the null result of Michelson-Morley experiment and for the constancy of light speed, without relative simultaneity, and that explanation can be length contraction as proposed by Lorentz. And I wonder how a smart person like Einstein could exhibit such a confusing mess about facts and knowledge, between ontology and epistemology. If you want one example of such confusion, you can find it in one of the most blatant and correct philosophical stances of Einstein, quote, "If it cannot be measured, or proved, it does not exist." This is an old and ridiculous known fallacy. It needs to be explained? Well, for example, if I ask you if unicorns exist, if you say no, you are strictly incorrect, as no one has ever seen a unicorn. The existence of unicorns is unknown. Absence of evidence can never be proof of non-existence. Nothing metaphysically forbids the existence of unicorns anywhere in the whole universe, even if all intelligent beings were blind. Knowledge does not determine facts. But tragically, this is the root of the problem with relativity. In order to avoid to confront that relativistic simultaneity is inherently contradictory, they have to blur the meaning of every philosophical concept, like reality, ideas, observation, proof, measurement, consistency, appearance, etc. If the tube is, quote, proved to be straight for observer A and bent for observer B, so be it. We have refuted the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction is contradictory, and it opens the door to prove anything. Now let's take a look at how Einstein constructed his theory. He deals with several different concepts here. How are they interrelated? Which element is contingent upon which? Einstein seems to start by putting C invariance and physical law invariance at the beginning. That is, they are the postulates, the starting points. Then we should read this as follows. If the constancy of light speed and invariance of physical laws is true, then it causes time dilation and relativity of simultaneity, and this in turn explains length contraction. This is what the arrows means. This causes, or explains, that, etc. The first relevant question here is, why Einstein chose light speed invariance and physical law invariance as the irreducible starting points? Are they the starting points? Are they irreducible? According to Einstein, length contraction is caused by relativity of simultaneity, and relativity of simultaneity is caused by light speed invariance. Then, what is the cause of light speed invariance? Mystery. As I will argue, the sequence is wrong. I will uphold that length contraction is the cause of the constancy of light speed, not the effect. It is true that Lorentz's proposal was ad hoc, but the interesting question is that an ad hoc explanation is not necessarily wrong. Lorentz accidentally found the right answer, but he did not understand what was really happening. He is not a philosopher, and was unable to defend his proposal. But I know, and thanks to philosophy I can offer detailed explanation concerning such hypothesis. To properly argue in favor of Lorentz length contraction theory is an explanation of Michelson-Morley null result, and to show how it can solve the problem of seemingly contradictory observations. Let's first put all this on proper order. This is what I am proposing. Length contraction and time dilation are really the starting points, and constancy of light speed and invariance of physical laws are derived from them. Let's see the implications. Let's assume that all starts with this two physical phenomenons. The moving train undergoes a contraction of its length by gamma as a function of its own speed, and its chronometer is time dilated also by gamma. Then let's recalculate what happens according to this. To the moving observer, the pulse travels forward length L contracted by gamma, at this speed. The difference of speeds, not c, hits the mirror, and travels back, at this. And the other gamma is the effect of time dilation on the clock. The two gammas represent the combined effect of time dilation and length contraction. They are inverse proportional here. So, then total time of travel is t. Then, it can be easily proved that this is invariant with velocity. So this is consistent with experiments. Length contraction is consistent with experiments. It explains how the moving observer always measures light speed as c regardless of the speed of the train. But now let's address simultaneity. According to length contraction theory, moving observer will assert that the pulses of light reach the mirrors, at. Again, this is length contraction of moving train, and this is time dilation. And, now we are trying to know if observers agree on the timings of events. That's why I have put this explicitly, in order to emphasize that we have to remove the effect of time dilation of the clock, so that this, t, is absolute time, so that we can compare apples to apples. And now what will say the stationary observer? As the observer is not moving, his value for time dilation of his clock is 1. It has no effect, but I have put it to show that the formula generalizes to any observer moving or static. And that is, t equals t. The two observers agree on the same timing of events, no contradiction between them, no relative simultaneity, the same facts for both, the same facts for any observer that happens to be there in any state of motion. Now, is this interpretation consistent with experiments, such as Michelson and Morley? Yes, because it shows that light is always measured as c regardless of observer's motion. Furthermore, is this theory consistent with my own requirement that all observers must agree on facts, that is, on the timings of all events? Yes, because you can see that the theoretical instant of events estimated by static observer A and moving observer B agree. In other words, simultaneity is absolute. So that goodbye relativity. Good riddance. You can also see that both theories, Einstein relativity, which I hold is false, and length contraction theory, as I have just explained, are mathematically equivalent with respect to experimental results. In both cases the maths will always give the same results, because the difference is not in the math, but on the metaphysical meaning of the math, that is, the interpretation, the physical phenomenon underlying the math and experiments. So, anything that Einstein's relativity predicts, it will be equally predicted by length contraction theory. Therefore, you cannot decide this dilemma from experiments, because any experiment is consistent with both theories. But relativity implies relative simultaneity, which I hold cannot exist, and length contraction theory eliminates the need of relativity. It takes out the very essence of relativity. The former implies disagreement between observers, the latter assert agreement between observers. This, ladies and gentlemen, this is the key question, contradiction or consistency. relativity is simply a rationalization invented to try to whitewash any contradiction or disagreement. It can be used for any purpose. If you do not agree on the shape of a tube, relativity of shape; if your accountants disagree, relativity of money; if the Schrödinger cat is dead and alive, relativity of death, etc. Many other people all over the internet, unsatisfied with the explanation offered by relativity, already have made tentative approaches to the Lorentz Length Contraction theory. They are all in the right direction, whether they are confused or have misunderstandings on the matter. This distrust for the illogic and inconsistence implied in the flawed concept of relativity is correct. Whether you accept or not the possibility that length contraction is in fact the solution to the Michelson-Morley experiment, I can tell you that what you heard here is all that can be said about length contraction hypothesis. If length contraction is correct, my argument presented here is the one and only argument that can be offered. There is nothing more. It cannot be clarified further, because it goes to the root of the question. It points to the metaphysical impossibility of relative simultaneity. It locates what went wrong in the relativistic scheme, and then it offers a correction that is consistent with experiment. But, above all, it brings agreement between observers, in the same way that refraction brings agreement between the observers of my previous analogy. And I want to insist, I can assure you that this dilemma cannot be decided from experiments, even if some experiment proved that objects physically contract, which I hold is true. Relativists can always say that this contraction is no contraction but an effect of relativistic simultaneity. So the question turns around philosophy. As you can see, placing time dilation and length contraction as primary causes explains light speed invariance and relativistic velocity additions, explains invariance of physical laws, implies absolute simultaneity, avoids all the metaphysically imposable implications such as relativity of simultaneity, is consistent with all experimental evidence, and all observers agree on facts. Thank you. Question: can length contraction theory explain the twin paradox? Of course, it can explain everything that relativity can explain. One twin remains static on Earth, and the other does a long travel at high speed, and return to Earth. Then the traveling twin is younger when compared to the static twin. Time has passed more slow to the traveling twin. This cannot be disputed. There are no tricks here, nor contradictory statements, nor anything that prevents the comparison of ages, by simply comparing clocks. Everyone agrees that the traveling twin is younger. Let's suppose that each twin sends a light signals to the other twin at a rate of 1 pulse per second. Which rate of pulses will each twin measure? Each twin will see the same change of the rate of pulses, coming from the other twin. According to relativity, this is the reason. Rate of signal observed by moving twin A and rate of signal observed by static twin B. And then, it can be proved that FA by FB is 1, so that the effect on signal rates that both twins see coming from the other twin appears symmetrical. But, what is the meaning of this formula? According to relativity, this is the effect of time dilation. And this corresponds to the effect of relative simultaneity. For relativists, this is caused by the, quote, inclination of the line of simultaneity, as seen in the space-time graph. But I say that relative simultaneity cannot exist, that the line of simultaneity has to be always flat. And, at the same time, the speed of the light that receives the moving twin has to be c minus v, not c. So this factor is in reality classical Doppler shift, not the effect of relative simultaneity. Here, you can see the nature of the conflict with relativity versus length contraction. The formulas are identical, but they mean different things. For relativity, this factor means the rate of change of relative simultaneity over space. For length contraction theory, this means instead classical Doppler shift. Relativists simply misinterpret the meaning of experimental data. The math is the same but the physical phenomenon underlying it is different. And how length contraction theory can explain the barn and pole paradox. Let's take whatever means of measuring lengths of the pole in the barn. Let's, for instance, put a detector that timestamps the instance in time in which each of the extremes of the objects is detected, T1 and T2. The observer on the barn must estimate the length of the pole as follows. This is because the moving pole is contracted by gamma. From the perspective of the moving observer on the pole, he sees this. In this case, however, the gamma is the effect of time dilation of his moving clock, so each observer sees the other to be contracted by gamma, but in reality, only the pole is really contracted. No relative simultaneity needed to explain this phenomena. And no matter which method of measuring lengths, you only has to replace relative simultaneity with length contraction, the result is the same, no relative simultaneity needed. Of course, in the twin paradox, as well as in the pole and barn paradox, length contraction theory can also handle the two twins moving. 3, 4, or more twins, barns, and poles, each with his own different speeds. Because the calculation can be generalized as follows. This formulas can be simplified, but I do not like to do so because in the explicit form it reflects what is happening, so it contributes to understanding of the phenomenons at work and how they contribute to the final result. Question: does the ether exist? The ether is nothing more than a spatial undulatory medium, like a spring and mass system. The electromagnetic field is the physical description of the ether. It has permeability and permittivity like any undulatory medium. It must exist because electromagnetic waves will not work without it. But ether in existence has no meaning, as electromagnetic waves will behave, as if the undulatory substance exists. You cannot tell any difference between waves with or without an undulatory medium. Waves will travel over space at absolute c, determined by permeability and permittivity, which is the equivalent of spring stiffness and mass, will propagate according to Fresnel-Huygens principle, will interfere, refract, etc. The ether is the electromagnetic field. You cannot dismiss the ether by calling it something else. The only controversial point is, waves in an undulatory medium necessarily implies that the speed of light will be fixed, i.e., anisotropic to different moving frames. But that can be explained by time dilation and length contraction, and therefore, light speed isotropy does not contradict nor disprove the ether. In fact, C isotropy is predicted by ether plus waves plus time dilation plus length contraction. Then, what is the weight of evidence? The evidence is interference, refraction, diffraction, polarization, Doppler shift, permittivity and permeability. Question: according to you, any moving object will physically contract, so 1 meter in a moving observer is not the same as 1 meter in a stationary observer. Is this not a contradiction, as observers disagree on the dimension of the meter? No. The theory is that every object, including the thing chosen as the meter standard, contracts as a function of its own speed. Therefore every observer agree on the same facts, which are that the length of moving objects are contracted by gamma compared to stationary objects. And this is valid even if the observer does not or cannot know which his own speed, v, is. Question: some scientists tried to verify length contraction by making a rod of carbon and measuring changes in electrical conductivity, that is a function of compression, and found nothing. Length contraction cannot be verified in this way. Length contraction is not compression. It is not the case that the rod is contracted, but not the carbon particles inside, which are pushed together, causing an increase in conductivity. Length contraction affects the rod and all its content down to the most elementary constituents. Resistivity due to length contraction is not this, but this.